Hi! In this video, I'm going to start talking about Danto's chapter Beauty in Politics. And I'm going to post the script, basically, for this video on the Quirkus page. Ordinarily, I wouldn't post pretty much exactly what I'm going to say if I was teaching in a classroom in person, because I would want to use the blackboard and further discussion to bring out these ideas. But because we're online and this is an asynchronous course, I think I'm just going to post the whole thing. So if you would rather just read that, it will pretty much cover everything that I'm going to say here. But I'm going to make the video because maybe it's nice to see a face and hear a voice sometimes, and so I'm going to give you that. You could also just take the audio and listen to it as you're looking at the handout. Okay, let's get to it. Danto, Beauty in Politics. What is Danto's motivating question? Mostly he is reflecting upon the 1993 Whitney Biennial show and kind of questions that it raised for him about the relationship between beauty and the political content of artworks. So the 1993 Whitney Biennial featured feminist works of art that focused on issues of social justice related to police brutality against Black people, domestic violence, and other issues. 1993 is 1 year after the major riots in LA over the Rodney King beating by LAPD. 1992 is the year when 4 police officers who brutally beat Rodney King after a car chase, they were acquitted, and that led to massive rioting and looting in LA. So this is just 1 year after that. We've got this art show, and a lot of the artworks are engaged with this kind of content and question. In fact, the video of the Rodney King beating that was shown widely on TV was included in the show, even though that wasn't shot by an artist and or created as an artwork. It was still something that had a massive impact on American society at the time. And so the curators included it. There are interesting questions there to ask about what is art and how we arrived at this moment where something that was not created with the intention of being an artwork could still be presented in the context of artworks. I'm not really going to engage with that. If you would like to, I can talk more about it. Those are really interesting questions. But my purpose in this video and using this reading this week in our course is really focused on the relationship between beauty and political content of artworks. So, okay. All right. So what is Danto asking in relation to the 1993 biennial? Well, first of all, this show received a lot of negative feedback. Danto describes it as deeply resented. And why was this? Why was this show kind of shocking, or why did it make people disgruntled about what was happening in the art world at the time? And he wants to think about whether that negative feedback was really justified. One of the main purposes of Danto's paper is to mount something of a defense of the 1993 Whitney Biennial against criticisms that appear to Danto to be motivated at least in part by the fact that these works were not beautiful, or even trying to be. To understand those criticisms, we have to understand why the art-going public expected to find beautiful artworks at the biennial, and the context for criticizing artworks for a lack of beauty in the history of art. The way that Danto puts his motivating question is, can art be aesthetically beautiful when its content concerns social issues? Danto's going to try to answer this question by making room for considering the artworks of the 1993 biennial as being artistically excellent, even though they are not beautiful. So separating out those two potential praise terms for art. And in fact, he's going to argue that a lack of beauty might be important to their artistic excellence, the artistic excellence of these particular works. He will argue that beauty can be incompatible with artistic excellence if the rhetorical aims of the artwork are incompatible with the kind of effect or mood that beauty produces. So he's going to have to give an account of the effect or mood that beauty produces. That's one task of the chapter, and then think about how that effect or mood might interact with certain contents of artworks in order to argue that some contents are not compatible with the mood of beauty. On Danto's view, in the end, it can actually become a criticism of a work that it is beautiful if it represents contents that should not be combined with the kind of mood that beauty invites. And he's going to talk about that as either consolation or relish. So let's pause and think for a second about possible praise terms for artworks: beauty, aesthetic value, artistic excellence. What do we mean by these three terms? How are they related? In the 1700s, particularly the sort of middle to second half, when philosophical aesthetics was really taking off, beauty was the main term of praise for artworks. It actually would have been odd at the time to say that a painting was really good if it wasn't beautiful. And if we think about the kinds of subject matter that were common then, still lifes of flowers, food, portraits of the people who could pay to have their portraits painted. They want to look good in them. Landscapes, grand history paintings, etc. These are themes and contents that fit well with being presented in a beautiful way. And in fact, it was kind of the thought about what the purpose of art was to represent things in the world in a way that gives visual pleasure. Now, that started to change in the second half of the 1800s when what Danto describes as the intractable avant-garde started to push those boundaries and started making artworks that were ugly. At that time, those artworks were usually still representing traditional subject matter, like portraits of people, landscapes, still lifes of apples and bowls, and things like this. But they were starting to do that in unexpected ways, say by using garish color combinations, unrealistic color combinations, so challenging both the idea that art should be kind of presenting us with a more or less realistic representation of something in the world, and then also that representation should be, at least on the face of it, visually pleasing. So we have had about 100 years at least of questioning the connection between beauty and art, but still, we do expect a certain kind of experience when we go to an art gallery. So let's just pause here and think. I want you to think about going to an art gallery, even if it was a long time ago now, as it has been actually for me, and kind of think about that atmosphere, the carpeting, the beautifully carved chair where you might sit and contemplate a painting under dim yellow light, and the kind of quietness of the room. Maybe you're going to murmur to a companion or something, and you're there as a kind of passive observer who's going to absorb the cultural insights or the knowledge of art itself that is presented to you by the curators and the artworks. Danto talks about this as being in two versions of an educational model of what the value of the museum is, and how that attitude is perhaps even more than the works not being beautiful. What the Whitney Biennial did was disrupt the idea that that was the way that one relates to the gallery space and to artworks, instead of kind of being a passive observer who just absorbs cultural value, as it were. Those artworks were calling people out and saying, hey, you're a part of this, a part of the world we're describing and talking about. You have a certain position within systems of oppression. Let's do something about it. And that was unexpected, and I think part of what Danto thinks was resented about the show. But let's return. So these three terms, what do they mean? Beauty, as we saw last week, is usually connected to pleasure in this context of philosophical aesthetics and talking about art since the time of Kant and Hume. Pleasure taken in the perception of the object or our immediate experience with the object. And that's what we usually mean by aesthetic. When we're talking about the aesthetic effect of an object, we're talking about the effect that it has on us in our experience of it in perception or our kind of immediate experience of it. That's supposed to contrast with, say, the cognitive effect of the object, which would be what we learn from it about what it is or the world, or its moral effect, whether we think something is right or wrong going on here. Is there something we should be doing in relation to it? As the aesthetic is presented as a separate domain from those other two, cognitive and moral, and what the aesthetic has to do with is just, we could talk about it as being the appearance of the object, but that can be a bit limiting at times. But so we talk about our immediate experience kind of in perception or through perception with that object. Okay, so when we say that something is beautiful, we usually have in mind that it's causing pleasure. Aesthetic value is a broader term for the value we find in an object's presence in perception or experience, and I think the introduction of this term was largely motivated by the fact that pleasure can be a bit limiting as a description of our positive response to aesthetic objects. We can stretch what we mean by pleasure so that however we feel in response to objects that are aesthetically good, we describe it as pleasure, but that can be a bit of a stretch. If we want to say something sort of specific about what we mean by pleasure, then it's going to exclude various other kinds of responses we have to artworks that we think are aesthetically good. So aesthetic value is just a broader term for our response to things that are aesthetically good. Artistic excellence is a little bit different again. It focuses our attention on the artist's skill or style or imagination or originality, etc. in creating the artwork and the features of the artwork that exhibit that skill. So it might be possible for us to say appreciate the artistic excellence in some dimension of an artwork, even though it doesn't have a whole lot of aesthetic value. Maybe it's technically very good, even though it doesn't come off some way in some way or other. Really, for something to be artistically excellent would mean that it's a very effective work of art at doing whatever it aims to do. That is how Danto is going to define this term of praise. And how that relates to aesthetic value, I think that whatever works have high artistic excellence would have aesthetic value in this broader sense that doesn't necessarily mean pleasure. And that's one reason why we might want to have a term like aesthetic value and use it instead of beauty when we want to talk about works that are moving, that are effective, that are poignant, that seem really good aesthetically, but not by way of kind of pleasuring us or giving us pleasure in our kind of perception and immediate experience of it. Let's look at Danto's The Place where he defines artistic excellence, and I'm going to spend some time kind of unpacking certain parts of this passage. Okay, so the passage goes, "My sense is that artistic excellence is connected with what the art is supposed to do, what effect it is intended to have. The work in biennial 1993 was intended to change the way we think and act on matters of injustice. A feminist work is not intended to secure our admiration for itself, but to compel a change in the way women are thought about and treated in our society. If it has that effect, if it makes viewers see injustices where before they were blind or indifferent to them, it is artistically excellent. One may study the work from the perspective of how it achieved its intended effect, but that is not the primary way in which we are meant to relate to it. The work is meant to change the way those who view it view the world. To see the world as a scene of injustice is ipso facto to be moved to change it." End quote. This is an important point. I'm going to linger on it for a minute. In particular, I want to talk about the part where he says, "One may study the work from the perspective of how it achieved this intended effect, but that is not the primary way in which we are meant to relate to it." Why is this line here? Danto has just told us that to evaluate the artistic excellence of a work, we need to consider how well the artist managed to execute the work's apparent rhetorical aims. And we'll talk more about rhetorical aims in a bit. But doesn't that sound an awful lot like studying the work from the perspective of how it achieved its intended effect? But then we are told that's not supposed to be the primary way we relate to it, to these works of feminist art. What's happening here? So in order to understand why Danto felt it necessary to emphasize this, and to help us clarify what he is saying for ourselves, I want to pause and consider the hugely influential idea that aesthetic appreciation is a matter of responding to the formal works of an artwork alone. Let's talk formalism. This is relevant to the reading by Devereaux as well. She's going to raise feminist criticisms of formalism in art, but what is this idea? Okay, let's talk about it. To start off, what are the formal features of an artwork? To help us with this, I'm going to turn to Robert Belton's book, Sites of Resistance, Approaches to Canadian Visual Culture, which is a textbook that I happen to have on my shelf. And I think he does give an explanation of the formal features of an artwork, contrasted with the content of works of art that is helpful for me, so hopefully it'll be helpful for you too. Alright, so here's Belton. Form means the constituent elements of a work of art, independent of meaning. For example, color, composition, medium, or size of a flag, rather than its emotional or national significance. Primarily formal elements are those features that are not a matter of semantic significance, that is, those that do not carry meaning the way a word does. These include color, line, mass, medium, scale, shape, size, texture, value, and their corollaries. The secondary features are the relations of the primary features with one another. These include balance, composition, contrast, dominance, harmony, movement, proportion, proximity, rhythm, similarity, unity, and variety. A third or tertiary level concerns the way form interacts with content and context. More about that in a minute. Okay, so yeah, the formal features of the work. Roughly, the things you can describe by looking at it, without talking about its content. Lines, colors, shapes, and how they are arranged on the how they are arranged in the artwork's composition. What kind of rhythm between these elements is present? Is it lopsided in some way, or is it well balanced? Where is the focal point of the composition? We can describe all of these things without talking about what the work represents. Is it a chair or a train, etc.? We can just talk about lines and colors and shapes and the way that they are arranged. When it comes to talking about an artwork's content, there are various different levels that Belton pulls out for talking about that too, which could be helpful. So let's look at that. Quoting from Belton, "The primary content is the simplest way of taking inventory of what you see as in literal images, straightforward subjects and imagery, the describable facts, actions, and or poses." I'm interjecting here. Are we seeing a portrait of a person, a woman wearing a hat? Or are we seeing a train barreling down the tracks? Just like, what is this an image of? Like, literally, that's the first level. Back to Belton. Secondary content is the result of pushing what you see into what you understand, so to speak. Sometimes that knowledge is conventional and the shift from primary to secondary is automatic, as when we recognize a blindfolded woman with a set of scales as Justice, or an athlete with a club and a lion skin as Hercules. Another category of secondary content is paralinguistic effect, and that's a matter of the way form affects meaning. So if one changes the delivery of the word or image, that is what we call the signifier, one can produce a corresponding change in the meaning of the word or image, that is the signified. These shifts can be conventional, evoking an immediate intuitive response. For example, everyone spontaneously recognizes the difference between fire and fire! That was still too happy. I've done this video a couple times, and each time I give a big grin when I'm going fire. Anyways, we get the point. If you say fire, we're probably talking about something hypothetical about fire. Whereas if you scream fire, that change in form, in the way that it's being delivered, changes the meaning to being, oh no, a fire is actually happening, get out of the building. Alright, so, okay, now that we have just kind of a quick overview of what we mean by the formal features of an artwork versus its content, now let's get an example on the table of somebody who had a formalist view about aesthetic value and evaluation. I'm going to take Clive Bell, and I'm going to give us a quotation from his book Art, written in 1914. I'm going to quote this at some length because I think it's helpful to have an example on the table, and it's for Devereux, for the purpose of thinking about Devereux's paper as well. Okay, so here's Clive Bell. What is the quality common and peculiar to all members of this class? He means art. Whatever it be, no doubt it is often found in company with other qualities, but they are adventitious. It is essential. There must be some one quality without which a work of art cannot exist, possessing which in the least degree no work is altogether worthless. What is this quality? What quality is shared by all objects that provoke our aesthetic emotions? What quality is common to Saint Sophia and the windows at Chartres? I'm probably pronouncing that wrong. Mexican sculpture, a Persian bowl, Chinese carpets, Giotto's frescoes at Padua, and the masterpieces of Poussin, Piero della Francesco, and Cézanne. Only one answer seems possible: significant form. In each, lines and colors combined in a particular way, certain forms and relations of forms stir our aesthetic emotions. These relations and combinations of forms, these relations and combinations of lines and colors, these aesthetically moving forms, I shall call significant form. And significant form is the one quality common to all works of visual art. I'm going to skip a little bit of his text. Let no one imagine that representation is bad in itself. A realistic form may be as significant, in its place as part of the design, as an abstract. But if a representative form has value, it is as form, not as representation. The representative element in a work of art may or may not be harmful. Always it is irrelevant. For to appreciate a work of art, we need bring with us nothing from life, no knowledge of its ideas and affairs, no familiarity with its emotions. Art transports us from the world of man's activity to a world of aesthetic exaltation. For a moment we are shut off from human interests. Our anticipations and memories are arrested. We are lifted above the stream of life. The pure mathematician, wrapped in his studies, knows a state of mind which I take to be similar, if not identical. He feels an emotion for his speculations which arises from no perceived relation between them and the lives of men, but springs inhuman or superhuman from the heart of an abstract science. What I have to say is this: the rapt philosopher and he who contemplates a work of art inhabit a world with an intense and peculiar significance of its own. That significance is unrelated to the significance of life. In this world, the emotions of life find no place. End quote. Bell's view illustrates two connected ideas, and many others, including the motivation to adopt a formalist position out of a desire to find something that all aesthetically valuable objects have in common, which is really hard to do. Aesthetically valuable objects range all over. It's going to be really hard to find a particular quality that they all have. The formalist finds colors and lines, and yeah, everything that we perceive, unless it's in black and white, has colors, has lines, and most often has color as well. That is something that you'll find in all aesthetically valuable objects. Of course, not all objects that have lines and colors, which is pretty much everything except for the black and white ones, are going to be aesthetically valuable, so you need to say something more. We can see in this passage that Clive Bell tries to say, okay, well, some things have colors and lines in this special aesthetically valuable way, which he's going to call significant form. It's going to be hard to define significant form in a way that isn't kind of circular, that doesn't sort of build in aesthetic value into the definition of what significant form means, but we can set that aside. We don't really need to worry a whole lot about kind of the details of Clive Bell's views or its problems. We're just using him as an example of this more general view, which is that what really matters to aesthetic evaluation and value is just the formal elements of the object. But two further ideas that Bell's view illustrates. The first that I wanted to touch upon is aesthetic distance, the idea that to properly appreciate an artwork's aesthetic qualities and values, we need to set aside all human interests from our lives, including moral and political concerns. This is supposed to be a separate domain, separate kind of value, and not one that requires us to pay attention to moral and political concerns. And in fact, if we were paying attention to moral and political concerns, the idea is that would in some way sort of contaminate our aesthetic interest and evaluation of the work. And we describe that putting aside kind of personal as well as moral and political concerns as being a kind of distance. And the second one is the universality of art. In this quotation, we find an example of a view that the world over, all aesthetically good artworks are good for having the same kinds of features, significant form, and presumably everybody will be able to find the same things aesthetically good, since nothing about our particular lives is relevant to appreciating this feature. So we can see the separation of aesthetic value from other kinds of cognitive but also moral and political concerns here is pretty stark in this in this particular example. And perhaps for that reason, a kind of strict or simple version of formalism, like Bell's, hasn't remained popular. This was a really big thing kind of in the really late stages and then the early part of the 20th century, but it isn't something that a lot of people still ascribe to, I would say. And partly that is because it makes it very difficult to talk about the content of artworks as being relevant to their aesthetic value, and that's just such an enormous part of the value of many artworks that we want to talk about. However, formalism can pop up again in more sophisticated forms, and I think it's worth considering what those look like for a minute, because I think it's relevant to the quotation we just had from Danto. Okay, so form at bottom is the relationship between different elements. The main way you can try to save formalism is by expanding what can count as elements within aesthetically significant forms. So on a strict or simple formalism, the only elements that count that can be related to one another in the forms are like the basic elements of visual experience, like colors, lines, shapes. An expanded or sophisticated formalism would include what pictures represent and mean among the elements that can enter into formal relationships. So then the idea is that it's still the formal relationships between different parts of the content, or between the content and the way that it is expressed or presented. It's still those formal relationships that we are appreciating, but the things that can be put into relationships in those forms include the content. Devereux calls this sophisticated formalism. I'm getting that term from her, not in the paper that we're reading this week, but elsewhere. And I'm actually going to take a quotation from another paper of hers where she gives an explanation of sophisticated formalism to kind of ground my own discussion of it. Okay, so this is Devereux. Quote, "According to this view, call it sophisticated formalism, understanding a work of art consists in grasping and appreciating the relationship between its form and content, that is, the connection between the message and the means used to convey it. Artistic success consists in expressing a particular message in an effective way. Sophisticated formalism thus allows, indeed requires, us to pay attention to the particular content of the work. Sophisticated formalism introduces a new conception of the aesthetic. The simpler version of formalism defined the aesthetic narrowly in terms of a work's formal elements considered by themselves. The new, more complex conception tracks the relation between form and content. A work's aesthetic achievement consists in the skill with which it expresses its content. Note that sophisticated formalism doesn't require abandoning the distinction between aesthetic and moral evaluation. Sophisticated formalism tells us to judge not the message, but its expression." End quote. And I wanted to give this quote in part because this sounds an awful lot like Danto's definition of artistic excellence. Sophisticated formalism is about tracking the relationship between the message of an artwork, or what it is trying to accomplish, and the means that the artist employed for doing that, the choices that they made about medium, about color and style and composition, etc. All those things. That sounds a lot like artistic excellence understood on Danto's definition of whether or not the artwork successfully and effectively does the thing that the artist meant it to do. So let's bring the conversation back to Danto. To remind us of what the quotation I'm talking about is, again, Danto writes, "One may study the feminist work from the," I'm interjecting the word on this, "one may study the feminist works from the perspective of how it achieved its intended effect. But that is not the primary way in which we are meant to relate to it. The work is meant to change the way those who view it view the world. To see the world as a scene of injustice is ipso facto to be moved to change it." End quote. So I think what Danto is doing by including this line, one may study the work from the perspective of how it achieved its intended effect, i.e. study it for its artistic excellence, but that is not the primary way in which we are meant to relate to it. I think Danto includes this because he's trying to head off the idea that the feminist works of the 1993 Whitney Biennial could be brought comfortably into a version of sophisticated formalism. The sophisticated formalist would look at these works and think about the formal relationship between what the works are, the artistic decisions that have been made, and their intended effects. Did they succeed? Could other artistic choices have done this better? But this is still thinking about the artwork, not the world. And that is the point Danto wants to make here. These artworks were not made to support reflections about their success or failure as art. They were made to support reflections about the world and its problems, racial injustice, domestic abuse, and to motivate their viewers to action. Even a sophisticated formalist in that case would miss the point of the work, fail to respond to it in the way intended, if she continues to stand around and think about it as a work of art. These are artworks that, on Danto's view, aim to break the fourth wall, as it were, to force the viewer to see through them to the immediately pressing problems of the real world. Danto, of course, is not doing that. He is philosophizing about the aim of these works and how to assess their artistic excellence fairly and accurately. By his own argument, I think what he is doing lies outside the primary way these works aim to get us to relate to them. That's the point. These works don't care about getting us to reflect upon their own artistic excellence. If they have it, if they are excellently crafted to achieve their goal, we will stop standing there thinking about art and throw ourselves into changing the world. This has been a long section, but I hope that it has helped to set the stage for this kind of radical suggestion of how to understand the artworks of the 1993 Whitney Biennial. And I hope that it's been helpful for grasping sort of how radical Danto's claim about what these artworks aim to do really is in the context of our thinking about how to appreciate art.